Right, it's time for another edition of our Klub Outside Q&A Roundup series, and I think this one promises to be pretty big. As always, Kubo takes and answers a variety of questions directly from fans over on his personal Q&A platform, and then we try to dissect those answers right here on the channel and see if there's anything of value to be found among them. Now, a lot of the time, Kubo's comments are a mix of light-hearted chatter and fluff, but sometimes we are given real, genuine insight into the story and world of Bleach that for whatever reason simply wasn't found in the original material. And as always, I'm not looking at every single answer he's ever given, nor even necessarily looking at them in chronological order. Mostly what I'm trying to do is to curate the answers that I find to be the most interesting and to have the most value, and then bring them to you. And so, speaking of which, this time the questions revolve around the topic of world balance, Arrancar outfits, Bankai training grounds, and more. A huge thank you to Tumblr user Wheelsome for providing the translations to the questions and answers, and collating them all in one handy place. It's a big help, and there's a link in the description to where you too can find them, so make sure to go and check them out. Right, on with the latest roundup then. We're looking at some slightly more abstract concepts and topics this time around, and we'll be kicking things off by looking at Kubo's newest lore drop regarding the balance of the three worlds, and, well, I feel like it's a pretty significant one. So let's dive in. Of course, before we get started, consider hitting subscribe down below if you're new here or if you just haven't done that yet. It's quick and easy to do, and it will help out massively on our journey to 300,000 subs by the end of the year. I really would appreciate all of the support, and it does mean absolutely everything. Also, check out my Patreon as well. That is another place you can go to support the channel even further, and again, it does go a very, very long way. So, of course, a shout out and a huge thank you to every single one of my Patreon supporters as well. It does mean absolutely everything. It's funny, this idea that the three main worlds of Bleach, the Soul Society, Hueco Mundo, and of course the world of the living, exist upon some kind of a perpetual balance, the collapse of which would subsequently destroy the universe, essentially, has been ever-present since the earliest days of the story. Really since Uryu and the concept of the Quincy were first introduced. The Quincy, of course, were revealed to be an anomaly who had the power to throw said balance out of whack, due to the fact that when they kill a hollow, that hollow is erased from existence. It does not pass on, it does not enter the cycle of rebirth, and so the balance shifts abnormally as a result. Despite the world-ending threat that upsetting the balance posed, the very idea of the balance as a concept wouldn't really return in any meaningful way until the Thousand Year Blood War arc. And I guess this makes sense, right? After all, that was the big return of the Quincy race as a major focus, and they literally opened that arc by purposefully destabilizing the balance, wiping out hollows in the human world en masse. We even got to see a tear in the fabric of reality that came about as a result, and Mayuri would later massacre an entire village worth of Rukongai residents to help shift the balance back to the center again, and these tears in reality would later be harvested for their energy by the Vizard, which was then used by Kisuke to power a cannon to the royal palace. It all sounds kind of crazy when you lay it out like that. Meanwhile, the very idea that the Soul King himself was the one responsible for regulating the flow of souls, and that killing him would collapse the three worlds back into one primordial state, was only introduced in this arc as well. But that was about the extent that the concept of the balance was really involved in the manga. The idea of the balance, and it potentially hanging on a knife's edge, never really comes up during the previous arcs at all after its initial introduction when Uryu first arrives, including the Arrancar arc, the longest arc of the series, which revolves around a huge war between the Shinigami and the Arrancar, who are ostensibly hollow. Or so we thought. Now, for the longest time, we've all assumed, and I think reasonably so, that when a Shinigami kills an Arrancar with a Zanpakuto, as is the case for 95% of Arrancar deaths in the arc, that said Arrancar is purified and sent to the Soul Society as part of the ever-continuous cycle of rebirth. But even so, maybe the balance should have been considered, right? Even if it's technically all happening as part of the cycle, it is still a large number of powerful souls being sent to the Soul Society over a fairly short span of time. So maybe That should have had some effect on the balance, and we just didn't really think about it. Well, to cut to the chase, a reader asked Kubo the following question, and Kubo's answer is very surprising and enlightening, and it reads as follows. Many Arrancar were defeated during the Arrancar arc, but did this not upset the balance of souls between the world of the living and Soul Society? To which Kubo replied, the moment a hollow becomes an Arrancar, they are removed from the category of vessels of balance, a term that was proposed when the soul measurement theory was completed, which coins the world of the living, Soul Society, and Waco Mundo as one such vessel. So this seems pretty huge to me, but we need to dive a little deeper, I think, and break it up some more. First of all is this term, vessels of balance, which is not a term we've ever heard before, but based on the context of Kubo's answer here, presumably, just means a being whose death will affect the balance. Shinigami, of course, were historically called balancers because they and their Zanpakuto were what maintained the balance, the status quo of the universe, even though they too must be vessels of balance as well. And that, in turn, was apparently determined by this so-called soul measurement theory, which was presumably conducted to figure out the deaths of which races in which worlds would affect the overall balance, and it turned out to be, well, basically everyone and everything. Again, I looked into it, this idea of a soul measurement theory, at least that terminology seems to be totally new, I think. But anyway, Kubo is basically saying that once a hollow becomes an Arrancar, their death no longer affects the balance. But how can that be? For their deaths to no longer affect the balance at all, wouldn't that imply that they now fall outside the cycle of rebirth entirely? That seems to me to be the only way for their deaths to have no impact. But then, if turning a hollow into an Arrancar removes them from that cycle, doesn't that have an impact on the balance as well? All of these hollow souls are suddenly disappearing. They're not dying, they're not being extinguished by a Quincy, but they are being transformed, and as a result finding themselves outside the balance all the same. And surely that kind of shift disrupts it too. But let's get on to the more pertinent questions. What does this mean for all of the Arrancar who were killed during the war? If they don't affect the balance, does this mean they don't enter the cycle of rebirth after all? Because them being cleansed by a Zanpakuto and sent to the Soul Society seems to conflict with this idea that they are no longer vessels of balance. But that would mean all of the deceased Arrancar no longer exist in any form, or at least any form that we are aware of. It's a little bit like what happens to the Sternritter when they die. Kubo cryptically said they go somewhere else. We don't know where, we don't know what that means, or what it has to do with the balance or anything like that, only that they presumably don't affect it. But for this to happen to the deceased Arrancar would not only upend everything we thought we knew, but it would A, kind of suck, to be totally honest, but B, and more importantly, seems to conflict with Xyloporo going to Hell. Although Hell is not part of the balance, as it supposedly predates the three worlds being created, it has nothing to do with those three worlds and them potentially collapsing, and Kubo himself doesn't mention Hell at all when talking about what falls under the remit of the soul measurement theory in that answer. The fact that Xyloporo is there at all means he was cleansed by Mayuri's Zanpakuto as a hollow would be. Mayuri's Zanpakuto treated Xyloporo as a hollow, which obviously makes sense because he is one. If Arrancar who were evil in life are still going to Hell, then it should still be that Arrancar who were good in life are being sent to the Soul Society, as we have always believed. Yet somehow they are still involved in the cycle of rebirth, yet on the other side of the coin are exempt from the balance. Kind of feels like the best of both worlds, to be totally honest. So let's look at a hypothetical situation. Say we find ourselves at the start of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc all over again. The Vandenreich has massacred a bunch of hollows to destabilize the balance, but to counter this, Mayuri moves to purge a bunch of Rukongai souls, just as he does in the manga. But, for the sake of this argument, imagine if he only happened to kill souls who were purified Arrancar from the Arrancar War. Would the balance just remain totally skewed? And he would have not only killed them for nothing, but he would still have to seek out and kill regular pluses. Or, once they are purified and find their way to the Soul Society and are presumably converted to just regular souls, do they then become vessels of balance? It's like them being Arrancar is them existing in some weird pariah state, but upon being cleansed, maybe they find their way back in. It's very strange. But I can kind of buy it working for Hollows who were Arrancarized through the Hogyoku, because it was almost like an unnatural evolution. But there are natural-born Arrancar, like Stark, for example, so was Stark just born outside the cycle of rebirth? He was born a spirit who didn't affect the balance, despite being born into one of the realms that came under the soul measurement theory. So, I guess at the crux of this matter lies a single question. Do the Arrancar still count as Hollows? Now it's interesting, there's actually a moment in the 1000-Year Blood War arc, very late in the arc, that kind of deals with this topic in an adjacent sort of way, and it's unexpected to see it be so relevant here like this. Now, before we discuss it, be warned, it is a spoiler for the remainder of the anime, so just be aware of that. But in chapter 666, after Grimjo rips out Askin's heart, Kisuke explains his reasoning for specifically healing the Espada and then working with him to try and take Askin down, saying, and I quote, "The Arrancar who had their masks torn off by Aizen can completely transform their spiritual pressure from an Arrancar to a Hollows during resurrection." That's the Viz translation, by the way, but it's essentially the same as the others. The gist of it is the same. And it's very interesting because it does imply that Arrancar and Hollow, despite ostensibly being the same thing, have totally different Reryoku, and thus maybe do count as two totally separate races, even though they are intimately linked. The point being, in the context of this chapter, I think anyway, that Kisuke wanted to make sure Grimjo could be in his resurrection for this fight, because the Hollow Reiatsu would be poisonous to Askin and have a better chance of killing him, implying that Arrancar Reiatsu is not poisonous to Hollows, if that's what Kisuke was getting at. And again, I guess that makes sense, because that explains why the Sternritter couldn't steal the resurrection of the Arrancar, because when they activate resurrection, they are no longer Arrancar, they have Hollow Reiatsu. Which again implies, as I just said, that Arrancars are not toxic to Quincy's. So their spirit energy changes that much. Anyway, if any of you are concerned that this means your favourite Arrancar actually maybe didn't pass on after all and has no chance of ever showing up again, well, the fact Xyloporo is in hell does seem to imply otherwise. Other returning Arrancar, like Mayuri's Kurotsuchi Corpse Unit, Charlotte, Dordoni, Saruchi, Lupi, seem to have returned thanks to his strange scientific means, as opposed to having anything to do with the cycle of rebirth, although that in itself is really weird because Mayuri harvests their long-dead corpses, which would imply that he has some way of getting their souls back? Very weird. That's a can of worms that we don't need to open right now. Also, I'm fairly sure this is the latest in what seems to be an increasingly long line of lore tidbits that contradicts Can't Fear Your Own World, as Ichibei pretty explicitly mentions during the prologue of the novel that him killing Grimjo would upset the balance considerably, but realistically, he would know that killing the Arrancar has no effect whatsoever, and I don't think he would stop to worry about wiping them out knowing that truth. So this was a fairly long topic, but I think it's a pretty big deal. Though I'm not entirely sure it makes total sense. I can buy the Arrancar not entering the cycle of rebirth as they are some kind of hybrid amalgamation, but then how did Xyloporo end up in hell? Even if hell has nothing to do with the balance, that still implies that the Zanpakuto treat the Arrancar as hollows and dispense judgment upon them as if they were. Finally, before we move on, I want to ask one more question. does the same rule apply to the Vizard? You know, if a Hollow undergoing Arrancarization strips them of their status as a vessel of balance, does the same thing happen to a Shinigami who undergoes Hollowification? Is Ichigo no longer a vessel of balance? Was Tosen no longer a vessel of balance when he died? When a Shinigami undergoes Hollowification, does that mean their Reiatsu is totally different from that of a normal Shinigami, like completely different, to the point where they may as well be two separate beings? It all kind of works, but if Tosen shows up in Hell, does that make sense? Again, a Shinigami goes to Hell under different parameters to a Hollow, so maybe it doesn't matter at all, but still. Anyway, that's really all I have to say on this for now. It's a big topic, and I think there are a lot of threads to pull at. It seems like a pretty huge revelation. Maybe it's just a way for Kubo to kind of hand-wave away the fact that, yes, a disproportionately large number of Arrancar were killed during the war and nothing seemingly came of it because he didn't think of it at the time. But I think lore declarations like this are very worth picking apart because they can have far-reaching and rippling consequences for the world building, but also they're fun to discuss. Make sure to let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Right, but next up we've got another pretty big topic, I think. One that's maybe a little upsetting in some ways because it's very weird, and it feels a bit out there. It probably won't require as much discussion, but I do have a lot of questions, so let's dive right in. A reader asked Kubo the following: who makes the outfits for the Arrancar living in Hueco Mundo? Are their outfits part of their bodies, and something that's naturally generated out of them? To which Kubo replied, they grow out of their skin upon completing their Arrancarization, and while some outfits are finalized during the growth process, there are some who customize theirs during said process. There are Arrancar whose hobby is actually customization. First of all, this is just really weird, I've got to be honest. The mere idea of Arrancar growing physical clothes from their skin is just strange. And I have to be honest, this never occurred to me. Now, we've said before that it does sometimes feel like Kubo's answers are led by the questions, and this kind of feels like maybe one of those instances again, purely because this reader's question feels so random to me, so out there, and yet so specific in their answer. And they happen to be totally correct. I just can't imagine why your first thought would be that their outfits are a part of their bodies, and then that turns out to be basically true. Like, what? Anyway, so it's a fairly simple premise. Once a Hollow becomes an Arrancar, they then grow clothes from their skin. I've seen some discussion surrounding the fact that we've seen a few Arrancar at birth, and they've all been naked. Stark, Lilinet, Wonderweiss. But this doesn't conflict with that, I don't think, as Kubo specifically says they grow out of their skin upon completing their Arrancarization. So once they become Arrancar, or I guess are born that way, they are initially naked, but then from that moment they grow clothes from their skin. Very weird. But this answer doesn't seem to contradict that, in my opinion. Like, Wonderweiss is completely naked when he is born from the Hogyoku, and we can assume he then grows clothes after that. Although with this knowledge, I'm kind of surprised that Wonderweiss has the capacity to imagine and generate like a full outfit for himself that actually, you know, is coherent. There are some weird examples though, like Ulquiorra kind of looks like he's wearing clothes in his flashback, but then he breaks his own mask in that white tree, becoming an Arrancar naturally. So maybe that is meant to just be his skin, from which he then grows clothes upon becoming an Arrancar. And again, in that kind of situation, once Ulquiorra has broken his mask himself, does he suddenly have the realization that, oh, I can grow clothes now? Or is it supposed to be a symbol of the fact that he has moved from an animal to a more civilized being? That comes with the realization. But what about when an Arrancar's clothes change during Resurrection? As is the case with virtually every Espada. For example, Stark is wearing very human clothes in both his base and Resurrection forms. So, does his skin change in that moment? Is he able to make that change that quickly? What about Barragan, who doesn't have any skin at all in his Resurrection? That's a bit of a weird one, and this is the sort of thing I would never have even thought about before this question popped up, so I guess in that case, it's a good one. But Baragon is seen wearing his purple robe, presumably before he becomes an Arrancar, although I always kind of thought Baragon was perhaps another natural-born Arrancar. Either way, once exposed to the Hogyoku, he gains, I guess you would call it a living human form, a flesh human form. Since he already has a human form, he gains skin in this new form, and so presumably creates his Arrancar outfit with that. Yet when he releases his Zanpakuto, he reverts back to his skeletal form, loses his skin, and so loses his clothes, but he gains back his purple robe and a brand new crown. He gains back the purple robe that he had prior to being exposed to the Hogyoku. It's very odd. I mean, Baragon's entire design, awesome as it is, kind of flies in the face of conventional holo design in the first place, so maybe not the best character to look at. Also, does this mean damaging their clothes technically counts as injuring the Arrancar? Like, for example, when Renji and Uryu blow up Xyloporo, his outfit is completely destroyed, like reduced to smoking tatters, to the point where he goes and changes clothes. And when he devours Lumina, his Fraxione, to restore himself, he fully heals himself in that moment, but his clothes are still wrecked, which is odd. The fact that he gets changed and comes back in a totally new attire seems to imply that this isn't his skin, right? Unless he's like shedding his skin when he goes and changes clothes. And they can grow clothes extraordinarily quickly. Maybe that's possible? Then there's the fact that Nell and Grimjo return in the Thousand Year Blood War arc with completely new outfits, despite the fact that child Nell reappears at the start of the arc in the same outfit she was wearing in Waco Mundo. So, did they grow new clothes? Or are we meant to believe that they don't always wear clothes they've grown themselves? But then that kind of defeats the purpose of the question, which was framed in such a way as to suggest the Arrancar had no other means of getting new clothes. The truth is I'm definitely overthinking this question about Arrancar outfits, but it seems like a strange one. There is one element to this, though, that I think could actually make some sense and work kind of well. Rarix211, who is a user over on fanverse.org, whose translations we have used in previous episodes of the Klub Outside Q&A Roundup, noted that whenever Ichigo enters his spirit body, he immediately has a Shihakusho on. And so what if that is him manifesting those clothes in a similar way, due to the influence of his hollow powers? Again, not something I would have ever thought about, but it's a good point, and even if it's not what Kubo intended, which let's face it, probably not, it could theoretically be explained away with this new revelation. It's something that Ichigo can do subconsciously, and I guess it's kind of weird that no one ever questioned why he suddenly had a Shihakusho, since being a Shinigami is just a job a soul can have, essentially, and the Shihakusho is the uniform of the Gotei 13 as woven by Senjumaru. It's weird that Ichigo just has one out of nowhere, and I think for all this time we've kind of just assumed that it just comes with the territory, that it just comes when like a mod soul is inserted into his body. That's what happens when you use one of those. Or when Rukia uses the glove, or Ichigo uses the substitute Shinigami badge, it just gives him a standard issue Shakusho. Like I said, it's kind of weird that it's never mentioned, but if he's growing said Shakusho subconsciously, I guess that could kind of work. It kind of relates back to the idea that his Bankai robe reflects his spirit energy. You know, like how said robe is essentially a part of his body, how he wears his power. Also, Kazui can do the same thing, but on an even higher level. He doesn't need any kind of conduit or anything like that. He can swap between human and soul body in a flash. Anyway, that's all I really have to say about this one. This is a weird one. Again, I'd love your thoughts down in the comments, but I think it's an odd one for sure. As for the two remaining topics, I think we can move fairly quickly here, though they are interesting in their own right. Kubo has asked the following question, which reads, after obtaining Bankai, training is required in order to be able to master it, but are there specialised Bankai training grounds? I'd also like to know how those who possess Bankai that affect others go about their training. To which Kubo replied, basically many people train in the outskirts of Rukongai. As for specialised Bankai training grounds, I will not answer it here. That includes whether there are any or not too. So Kubo's back, doing his weird cryptic teases again, which probably won't lead anywhere, but it's all fun, all the same, I guess. Why wouldn't he want to answer it? I don't know. Is he meant to be implying specialized Bankai training grounds will play some nebulous role in a future storyline? I doubt it, but sure. He won't even say whether or not they exist, which is weird. Maybe he just can't be bothered. But anyway, this is fairly simple. It makes sense that most powerful Bankai-wielding Shinigami would excuse themselves to the farthest reaches of Rukongai in order to practice, especially those with area of effect abilities. The only real insight we get into this is, of course, Ichigo and Renji training for Bankai in Kisuke's underground training arenas, where we also learn Kisuke himself unlocked Bankai as well. And I guess these are kind of specialized training grounds, though presumably not what Kubo means. And then in chapter 423, in the aftermath of the Arrancar War, we see Hitsugaya training with his Bankai in a cave somewhere in the Rukongai wasteland, which reinforces Kubo's answer here. And we can see that the process of training his Bankai has covered the inside of the cave in ice from head to toe, so it's clear why he felt the need to take that training as far away as possible. It is kind of funny as well to consider certain Shinigami trying to train their Bankai after obtaining it. Like, was Soifon just firing off nukes in the Rukongai over and over again? Presumably those explosions could be seen from the Seirete. It's the same with someone like Komamura. Was he battling Kokujo Tengen Mio miles away? Again, the enormous giant would likely be visible from the Seirete, and it's not exactly the sort of Bankai you can cram into a cave. And then finally, Kubo gave us a nice piece of Quincy terminology that we'd been missing as a reader asked him the following question. The ring above the head on a Quincy's Volsten dish is called Korin, or Heilig Schlein, but do the wings have an official name? To which Kubo replied, it's called Koyoku, or Heiligen Flügel. Horrible pronunciation aside, that's pretty cool. For some reason it never occurred to me that the wings would have a name, but I guess it makes sense and it's a pretty fitting name too. I will say, I don't think the Volstendish wings were the top priority for Quincy terminology that we needed to know. Like, I'm surprised no one's asked Kubo what the Vandenreich name for Hirenkyaku is yet, because it's weird to me that the Quincy movement technique doesn't actually have an official, in quotes, name, by which I mean a German name, one used by the Empire itself. The only reason we know it as Hirenkyaku and nothing else is because the Ishida family are Japanese, and they were the only touchstone we had for the Quincy until the Thousand Year Blood War arc. Though, having said that, virtually all of Uryu's abilities are in German, so that's kind of weird. But it's also weird that Mairi even goes so far as to mention in his battle with Pernida that he is sure the Vandenreich has a name for Hirenkyaku when he reveals that he can use it, but it's never brought up or revealed. It's weird, and I'd be interested to know what it actually is, but alas, maybe that's for another Q&A. Alright everyone, but that's it for today's video and the latest iteration of the Klub Outside Q&A Roundup series. As always, I do hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you took something of value away from it as well. I think this was a pretty good one, a pretty big one, a couple of crazy topics here, especially that pretty major, I would say, lore reveal about Arrancar no longer contributing to the balance upon their deaths. That seems to have pretty big ramifications to me, but as always, I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. Once again, thank you so very much for watching. Consider hitting subscribe if you haven't done already. It does help out the channel massively as we try and reach 300,000 subs by the end of the year. Check out the Patreon as well. Help to support the channel that extra step further. It really would go a very, very long way. Get your name in the credits of every single video just like this. And at the $2 tier or higher, get all of my videos completely free of YouTube ads. Alright guys, until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.